Have you ever felt like you're shouting into the void, praying with all your heart, but the heavens seem closed and God feels a million miles away? You're not alone, and what I'm about to share might completely change how you see those silent moments. We've all been there, right? Those seasons when we pray and pray and pray, pouring our hearts out, asking for direction, begging for help, crying out for answers, and all we get back is silence. The kind of silence that makes you wonder if anyone's really listening up there. The kind that makes you question everything you thought you knew about faith. But here's something that might blow your mind. What if that silence isn't God ignoring you? What if that silence is actually God working in ways we can't see yet? Think about it like this. When a butterfly is inside its cocoon, struggling to break free, everything looks dark and hopeless from the inside. The caterpillar has no idea that something beautiful is being formed. It just knows the struggle, the darkness, the silence. And here's the thing. If someone cuts open that cocoon to help the butterfly escape early, that butterfly will never develop the strength it needs to fly. The struggle in the darkness is what makes the wings strong enough to soar. Now let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this. When has God spoken to you the clearest? Was it during the easy times when everything was going perfect, or was it during or after those hard seasons when you had nowhere else to turn? I'm willing to bet it was the latter, and there's a reason for that. God's silence does something powerful in us that His voice sometimes can't. It strips away all the noise, all the distractions, all the things we thought we needed. When God is silent, we stop relying on feelings, and we start building real, deep, unshakable faith. We move from wanting to hear God to trusting God even when we can't hear Him, and that's where real spiritual maturity begins. Look at some of the greatest people in the Bible. They all went through seasons of silence. Joseph spent years in prison, falsely accused, forgotten by everyone, and the Bible doesn't record God speaking to him once during those years. Can you imagine? Going from having dreams from God to sitting in a dark prison cell with nothing but silence. But here's what's wild. God was positioning Joseph the entire time, preparing him for a purpose so big that Joseph needed those silent years to be ready for it. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before God spoke to him through the burning bush, 40 years of absolute silence after running away from Egypt. That's not 40 days or 40 weeks, that's 4 decades of wondering if God had given up on him. But during that silence, God was transforming a murderer and fugitive into the man who would lead millions out of slavery. And we can't forget Jesus himself, can we? Think about this. Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane, sweating drops of blood, asking God if there was any other way, begging for the cup to pass from him. And what did he get? Silence. The heavens were quiet. There was no voice from heaven, no angel appearing with a different plan. Just silence. And then Jesus had to walk to the cross anyway. But that silence, that hard, painful silence, it was leading to the resurrection, to salvation for all of humanity, to the greatest victory the world has ever known. Here's something I learned the hard way, and maybe you need to hear this today. God's silence doesn't mean God's absence. Just because you can't hear Him doesn't mean He's not working. Just because you can't see Him doesn't mean He's not there. Sometimes God is most active in our lives when He seems most absent to our feelings. Let me share something personal with you. There was a time in my life when I prayed for something specific every single day for over 2 years. Every morning, every night, sometimes multiple times throughout the day, I would bring this same request to God. And you know what I heard back? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. No signs, no answers, no peace, just silence. I started to feel crazy, like maybe I was doing something wrong. Maybe God was mad at me. Maybe my faith wasn't strong enough. But now, looking back, I can see exactly why God stayed silent during that season. What I was asking for would have taken me down a path that wasn't His best for me. I just couldn't see it at the time. God's silence was actually God's protection. It was His way of saying, not yet, not this, I have something better. And when the right thing finally came along, I didn't even have to beg for it. It just happened naturally. And I understood why all those prayers before went unanswered. So what do we do during the silence? How do we keep our faith when heaven feels closed? Here's the key. We keep showing up. We keep praying even when it feels like we're talking to the ceiling. We keep reading the Word even when it feels dry. We keep serving even when we don't feel inspired. We keep trusting even when we can't see the path ahead. Because here's the truth. Faith isn't about always feeling God's presence. Faith is about trusting God's character, even when we can't trace His hand. The Bible tells us that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever, which means the God who parted the Red Sea is the same God in your life right now. The God who brought Jesus back from the dead is the same God handling your situation, and just because He's working quietly doesn't mean He's not working powerfully. Think about how God works in nature. When you plant a seed in the ground, nothing happens for days, weeks, sometimes months. If you dug up that seed every day to check if it was growing, you'd actually kill it. The most important growth happens underground, in the dark, in the silence, where nobody can see. The roots have to go deep before anything can grow tall, and the same is true for our faith. During God's silence, our roots are going deeper. We're learning to trust Him not because of what He's doing, but because of who He is. We're learning to worship Him not for His blessings, but for His presence. We're learning to follow Him not because the path is clear, but because we know the guide is faithful. And that's the kind of faith that can weather any storm. Here's another thing. Sometimes God is silent because He's already spoken, and we just need to obey what He said last. How many times do we keep asking God for the next step when we haven't taken the last step He showed us? How often do we beg for a new word when we haven't lived out the old word? God doesn't need to keep talking when His last instruction is still on the table waiting for our obedience. And can we talk about something real for a second? Sometimes we can't hear God because we're surrounded by too much noise. We're constantly plugged into our phones, our music, our shows, our distractions. We fill every quiet moment with something, and then we wonder why God feels distant. Maybe the silence we're experiencing is actually an invitation to create more silence in our lives, to turn off the noise, to sit still, to wait, to listen deeper than we've ever listened before. The prophet Elijah learned this lesson in a powerful way. He was looking for God in the earthquake, in the wind, in the fire, in all the loud, dramatic things. But God showed up in the still, small voice, in the gentle whisper, in the quiet moment. We're so busy looking for God to show up in big, obvious ways that we miss Him in the subtle, everyday moments. So what if God's silence is part of His plan? What if the waiting is just as important as the answer? What if the journey through the quiet is preparing you for a purpose bigger than you can imagine right now? What if God is teaching you to trust His heart even when you can't see His hand? I want to leave you with this. Don't waste your waiting. Don't spend your silent seasons bitter and angry and distant from God. Lean in closer during these times. Press into prayer even when it feels dry. Dig into the Word even when it feels like just words on a page. Gather with believers even when you don't feel like it. Because when you look back on this season, you'll realize that God was never absent. He was just working in the unseen, preparing you for everything He promised. The silence won't last forever. The sun will break through again. You'll hear His voice clearly once more. And when you do, you'll be stronger, deeper, and more ready than ever before. So hold on, keep trusting, keep believing, because God's silence is not His rejection. It's His preparation, and something beautiful is coming.